Hello everyone, this is Peter Sco for Music is a Journey, and today we're going to look at our third installment of the first 10 albums of a particular band. We previously saw how Aerosmith rose to fame and fortune, then basically crashed because of drug abuse, but then managed to gather themselves back together again and once more rise to fame and fortune. Then we saw how Blue Oyster Cult rose to fame, stumbled a little, rose to even greater fame, and then started to splinter and fall apart until the band was almost in a state of limbo. Today we're going to take a look at the infamous German hard rock band Scorpions. Now before we get started, before preparing this video, I checked a number of different sources, including Wikipedia, band history of the Scorpions on the Scorpions website, and a number of videos on YouTube. And there were some discrepancies in the actual information that was given. For example, one video said that it named all the famous members of the band from the 1980s and said that they had formed in the late 60s or mid 60s, which of course was not really true. Then we heard how Michael Schenker said how basically he was responsible for everything, and everything the Scorpions did afterwards was his older brother trying to copy him. Okay. And then we heard also about how Klaus Meine and Rudolf Schenker were telling their story of, kind of quick story of how the band formed and how things happened. But again, everything was kind of around those two, as if they were the ones that had been leading everything. And the Scorpions website basically made it sound like every step of the way the Scorpions were just stepping towards success. So there are a lot of grains of salt to be taken while researching for this video. I'm going to do my best to go with the information that I think is probably correct. However, there's always room for error, I think. So the Scorpions formed in 1965. It was originally Rudolf Schenker, who, of course, as with many young Germans at the time, had been greatly influenced by the British beat bands, particularly the Beatles, but also the Who and the Rolling Stones and the like. Rudolf had already been a member of a couple of other bands before deciding to form Scorpions. At the time, he was actually the lead vocals. However, as the 60s wore on, some of the members came and went. Some had to go for their German army draft. And as it so happened, his younger brother Michael, around 1969, had been asked by a local German singer, Klaus Meine, if he would join in a band called Copernicus, which were basically a cover band. So, with some openings in the band, Rudolf asked his younger brother and Klaus if they would join him in his band, Scorpions, which they did. So basically, New Year's 1970, Klaus and Michael Schenker joined Rudolf Schenker in the Scorpions. Now, the band worked very hard and got some attention, and they won a contest, and that allowed them to record 2 songs, which they did, Action and I'm Going Mad. Now, these 2 early recordings actually never appeared on any of their albums, but they appeared on a compilation called Psychedelic Gems 2. So if you can get a hold of that, you can hear the early versions of those 2 tracks. In 1971, the band met producer Coney Plank, who said that he really wanted to produce their first album. So, on February 9th, 1972, on the RCA label, Scorpions' debut album, dust on it here, Lonesome Crow, was released in Germany. It was released a year later in North America, I think. The music was actually, according to Wikipedia, the soundtrack for an anti-drug movie called Das Kultparadies, or something like that. The album here features 7 tracks, and this is really interesting. If you were a fan of the Scorpions in the 1980s and you decided you wanted to get everything they did, you would be really surprised with this album here. Wikipedia calls it an example of krautrock. Now, it's kind of interesting because Rudolf Schenker insists that they were not doing things like Can and Kraftwerk and those kinds of bands which evolved into that kind of early electronic music sound. They wanted to be a hard rock act, and they said that was a very rare thing in Germany, or at least in Hanover, where they were from. But of course, in the early 70s, there were other bands too, like Eloy's first album was pretty much hard rock. There was Lucifer's Friend, which was really heavy stuff with John Lawton, English singer John Lawton on vocals. There was Blackwater Park, and another band, I can't remember what their name is now, but their album was called Morning Sun, like morning as in mourning the dead. So there were actually quite a few heavy rock or hard rock acts in Germany at the time. This album here is, though, really different in the Scorpions catalog, especially considering the Lonesome Crow track is something like 16 minutes long, and basically a lot of extended instrumental parts with different kind of experimentations to it. Even standard tracks such as In Search of Peace of Mind are quite bizarre because they don't follow a standard hard rock format. In Search of Peace of Mind has this kind of electric introduction, like almost like an anthemic type thing, like da 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 dum bum 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 da 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 dum bum 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 bum, and then it goes into this pleasant, gentle acoustic bit. But then there's a bit of a spacey gap with some wind blowing, and then this kind of like a eerie mode sets in, and then it gradually gets kind of heavy with the distorted guitar, and Klaus is screaming out the lyrics at the very end. A lot of the songs go through these kind of motions like this. Either that or they have more of a kind of a jazzy bass line and a bit of a swing to them. So very different stuff. My best friend was a huge fan of the Scorpions in the 1980s, but he wouldn't touch this one. So the songwriting credits go to the Scorpions, but in an interview I saw on YouTube, Michael Schenker claimed that basically he and Klaus wrote everything, except In Search of Peace of Mind, that was entirely his creation. So he went on to claim that his brother Rudolf basically tried to copy whatever he was doing, whatever Michael Schenker was doing later on in UFO, Rudolf was trying to copy for the Scorpions. I think the word arrogance is a little bit suitable here, but hey, what do I know? They must have had some interesting family gatherings, though, I think. So Scorpions' Lonesome Crow, they went on tour for this in 72-73. They opened for Rory Gallagher, they opened for Uriah Heep, and of course they famously opened for UFO as well. And when UFO came to Germany, their guitar player didn't get his visa sorted out properly, so he wasn't able to play. He wasn't able to perform in the country. So UFO asked if Michael Schenker wouldn't mind playing the lead guitar parts during their shows. So what happened was Michael Schenker would kind of stay back a little bit, not stand out too much, and play the lead for UFO, and then he would come on with the Scorpions and take his usual spot up at the front of the stage. But of course, by the end of the tour, UFO extended the invitation to Michael to become their new lead guitarist. And he was, at that time, Michael Schenker was 17, 18 years old, basically. In 1973, he was 18 years old. And he had always said, if I get an offer from an English band, I'm going. So he left. And, you know, in one interview with Rudolf and Klaus, they said they saw him off at the airport and wished him good luck and watched the plane take off. And then they thought, what's going to become of the Scorpions now? That's it. The band is basically done. And it seemed that without their lead guitarist, their record label kind of lost interest in them as well. So, basically, the first lineup of the Scorpions dissipated. The band was done. Of course, they were not done. Actually, they still had some touring they had to do. Which, to do that first, they needed someone to step in for Michael. So, they asked their friend Uli John Roth, who was also a local guitarist and very well known, and he came in and he finished the tour with them. They then offered the position of lead guitar to him, but Uli had his own band, Dawn Road, and he said no, he was going to stick with that one there. Well, after a while, Rudolf went down and watched them at some rehearsals, and he really wanted to work together with Uli. So Uli said, okay, why don't you join the band, and then bring along your vocalist from the Scorpions as well. So Rudolf Schenker and Klaus Meine joined Ulrich John Roth, in his band Dawn Road. However, Dawn Road had only ever done some demos, while the Scorpions had actually released an album on a major label and did a lot of touring around the country. So they decided, let's use the name the Scorpions because that's one that has already got a foot in the door. So the other members that were already there, besides Uli John Roth in Dawn Road, was Francis Buchholz on bass. We had Achim Kirschning on keyboards and Jürgen Rosenthal on drums. However, after the recordings for the next album, Achim decided to leave the band. He did, however, come in as a session musician on the next couple of albums. So the next album in the Scorpions catalog was released in 1974, and this is Fly to the Rainbow. Now, once again, this is a unique album in the Scorpions catalog. Very different still from Lonesome Crow, but also very different from what was going to come after this. Remember, this is basically Dawn Road, with 2 of the Scorpions members added to it. They have a keyboard player in here. So what we have here is more of a kind of progressive hard rock album. We do see a song like Speedy's Coming, the opening track, which is a really good hard rocking song. But a lot of the other ones, such as Drifting Sun, Fly to the Rainbow, and a few others there, they extend over 6-7 minutes long. They have some of them, like Fly to the Rainbow, has multiple parts. Drifting Sun has this kind of extended instrumental section. Yeah, once again, if you were a fan of the band in the 1980s and you went and picked up this album, you'd be in for a bit of a surprise. In fact, I remember a guy in one of my junior high school classes who really loved Love at First Sting and Blackout. And so I brought my Walkman to school one day and I said, you gotta check out this Scorpions track. And I let him hear Drifting Sun, and he just kind of looked at me like, like, what's this? I actually think it's a pretty cool album going back and listening to it now, and I like the fact that there's only one album like this in their catalog that really stands out. So apparently after the recordings of this album, also Jürgen Rosenthal was drafted into the German army, so he had to leave the band. And when he later on came back, he actually joined Eloy and played on 3 albums with them. After this, the Scorpions also went through a few drummers until they settled on a Belgian drummer named Rudy Lenners. Rudy would stay with them for their next 2 albums. The Scorpions' 3rd album was an album of a lot of firsts. In Trance was released on September 17th, 1975. It was the first album to feature this new Scorpions logo, which would stay with the band ever since. It was also the first album with Dieter Dierks producing, and he would stay with the band also right up until the end of the 80s. And it was also the first of the Scorpions albums to feature a controversial album cover. This one here, a blonde woman is holding a guitar, which is actually Uli Jon Roth's guitar, and she has a bit of a breast exposed here. The album cover actually had to have the breast blocked out in some countries. However, this was not to be the most shocking or most controversial of the album covers. This was just the first of a few. The album also features a new style for the Scorpions. They moved away from all those more like a krautrock or progressive rock type pieces and settled into more just straight up hard rocking tracks, none of them lasting more than 4 minutes long, I think. There are a lot of really interesting tracks on this. This was actually the only Scorpions album I never had on cassette during the 1980s. When I finally did pick it up on CD, it was kind of a surprise because I'd expected something closer to the next 2 albums, but not quite. This was still a kind of stepping stone to getting there. The opening song, Dark Lady, is pretty cool. It's got this interesting growly guitar effects, and then it's a very intense song with vocals shared between Uli Jon Roth and Klaus Meine. There was Sun in My Hand, which is showcasing Uli Jon Roth's inventive guitar playing and also some of his Jimi Hendrix influences. Robot Man was one of the songs off of here. Top of the Bill, one of the straight up hard rockers. And I've forgotten which one it is now, but maybe Evening Wind? One of the tracks on here features a bass line that is very Rush-esque. An interesting album for sure, certainly not one of my favorites, but definitely some cool tracks on here, and once again, a stepping stone in the Scorpions' sound development. The Scorpions' 4th album was released on November 22nd, 1976. Here is the back cover featuring the band. The album cover that was actually used in a lot of countries was another version of the band. However, this is probably the Scorpions' most controversial album cover. You'll know it if you've seen it. It's this. The Wikipedia article on this album is probably the longest of all of the Scorpions albums, or at least the first 10 anyway. The album, of course, the title is Virgin Killer, and the song's lyrics are actually saying about how time is the killer of innocence. You start off as an innocent child, but as you grow into an adult and you learn more about the world and experience the world more, you lose that innocence. And that is the theme behind the lyrics. However, the product manager at RCA had the clever idea to come up with a really outrageous album cover. And the album cover is, of course, a girl who is about 10 years old. I don't know why I keep looking. I know she's about 10 years old. Girl who is 10 years old. Actually, it was either the daughter or the niece of the photographer. And she is posed in the nude with her genitalia covered by a cracked bit of glass, as if she is a photo behind a glass frame with a crack in it. Now, in a way, that's kind of interesting because that does symbolize the meaning of the song. You have an innocent young girl, however, she is posed in an inappropriate way for a child. And the crack in the glass, particularly over that part of her body, is almost like, the beginning of the destruction of her innocence. Now, it's a big problem. It was and still is a problem because, of course, it is a pre-adolescent girl posing in a kind of erotic pose in the nude. There's a lengthy article on Wikipedia telling you about all the issues about this. And of course, once again, the album cover that most people saw was another version of this photo here. It was, in some places, it was deemed inappropriate, kind of borderline illegal child pornography. At one point in Sweden, it was actually determined as first-level child pornography, meaning erotic pose, but nothing, no sexual acts. However, the photographer who took the picture said not only was he there, but his wife was there, the girl's mother was there, 3 female assistants were there, everybody was there taking care to make sure that the girl did not feel uncomfortable, I guess. And he made an interesting point saying that, in those days we loved our children, we didn't think about having sex with our children. Right, but of course with today's internet and child pornography kind of being rampant on the internet, I think I'm regurgitating what I read in the article. It is very sensitive thing here. So yeah, when I had the cassette in the 80s, I had the band cover, and when I ordered it on CD, I got the explicit cover. Anyway, cover aside, because there's a lot of talk about the cover, what else can we say here? So I think we have the same lineup as we had with In Trance. We have Dieter Dierks producing the album once again, and we have an album that actually, this was the first album to get attention outside of Germany, and it was the first album to get attention outside of Europe. And it placed number 32 on the Oricon charts in Japan. So that's kind of interesting. There are some really awesome tracks on here. I mean, the first one, Pictured Life, that is just a great opener to the album. It's a ripper of a track. Follow that with Catch Your Train. We've got 2 solid, hard-hitting songs. In Your Park is probably like the first of the Scorpions' power ballads. Still not exactly where they would get to by the 1980s, but nevertheless showing the way. The title track, Virgin Killer, has just got a terrific riff, and Uli Jon Roth says that it was after having toured with Kiss, he was kind of inspired to try to write a riff like that, and then he just started singing along with it. He's a virgin killer, and Klaus heard that and said, that's a great riff, you got to do something with it. I think it's a really fantastic song. It's just so cool. 1976, this really heavy hard rocking track like that. On side 2, we have Hellcat and Polar Nights, both with Uli Jon Roth singing, and both of them have this Jimi Hendrix groove to it, showing Uli's Jimi Hendrix influence. And of course, Yellow Raven, which is another one of those kind of Scorpions ballad type things. And Crying Days, which I never thought all that much of, apparently was also covered by some power metal band later on. Virgin Killer remains one of my favorite Scorpions albums, and just show the side of the cover here. I guess it's worth mentioning as well that the album cover was actually, it made it onto a lot of worst album covers ever lists. This is also the last album to have their keyboard player, what did I say his name was, Achim, on as a session player. So after being part of the recording sessions of Fly to the Rainbow, he was then a session player for In Trance and Virgin Killer. This is also the last album to have Rudy Lenners on drums. In December 1977, the Scorpions released their album Taken by Force. Now you'll see I have this album cover here. That's curious. I thought I had the original. I don't. Well, I'm surprised. The original one is, of course, a picture of two young boys playing war, shooting at each other in a graveyard, in a cemetery. And in a wartime cemetery, nonetheless. And this also caused some disturbance. However, Uli Jon Roth defended that, saying it was not intended to be offensive. It was something to basically literalize what's going on. Like you have youths who are like, 15 years old. They barely know a thing about life. And, they're being sent off to fight in wars and kill people. And he said that that's kind of what the album cover was supposed to be symbolizing. However, in many countries, they got this album cover as well. And I don't know why I got it. Maybe I bought this one in Canada, but I got Virgin Killer in Japan. So after Rudy Lenners left the band, they picked up Herman Rarebell on drums. And Herman had actually spent some time over in England and had played with a couple of bands there. He was quite an experienced drummer, and he would, of course, become the band's drummer right through till, I think, sometime in the early 90s. So the classic lineup is coming together, as we now have Rudolf Schenker and Klaus Meine. We have Francis Buchholz on bass here, and we have Herman Rarebell on drums, and of course Uli Jon Roth on guitar. However, this would be Uli's last studio album with the band. What a really cool album, though. I often have a hard time deciding which I like better, this one or Virgin Killer. We start with the song Steam Rock Fever. Curiously, they have a jackhammer sound that goes through the whole song. I always thought it was just at the beginning, but more recently I've noticed it plays through the whole song. One thing that's kind of cool here is the chorus goes, Steam Rock Fever, Screaming Rock Believer. And the latest album by the Scorpions, released just last year in 2022, is called Rock Believer, and the chorus goes, Scream for me, Screamer, I'm a rock believer, just like you. So there's this kind of connection going back to Steam Rock Fever, Screaming Rock Believer. We have We'll Burn the Sky, which was actually a song written by Monica Dannemann, who was Uli Jon Roth's girlfriend at the time, but she was Jimi Hendrix's last girlfriend there, Jimi Hendrix's girlfriend at the time of his death. And apparently he died in her London apartment, and it was something that she'd never forgiven herself for. So she wrote this song, this poem, and they turned it into a song. Sadly, Monica would end up taking her own life sometime after that, while she was still with Uli Jon Roth. Then we've got one song here, I've Got to Be Free, which Klaus Meine sings very passionately. But apparently, I read somewhere, it was actually a song written by Uli Jon Roth, beginning to state his dislike for the musical direction the band was going in. And it's, of course, the reason then after this album here that he chose to go off and start his new band, Electric Sun. We have The Sails of Charon, which has one of the coolest riffs of 70s heavy rock, and apparently a very difficult one to play. Also, this features the lead guitar playing of Uli Jon Roth, which has a very neoclassical style, which is funny because after listening to Deep Purple a lot and reading about the neoclassical guitar style of Ritchie Blackmore, I went back and listened to this album, and it just dawned on me, hey, that's neoclassical guitar style. Which later on I read is true. Yay, for me. Then we also have He's a Woman, She's a Man. Is that politically incorrect these days? Well, it's a really great rocking song. And an interesting song called Your Light, which almost sounds like a Christian song, because it keeps saying, like, when you're down and out, and when you're blue, and when you don't know what to do, it's all right, he's by your side. And these lyrics keep coming up, talking about, like, when things are going rotten in your life, and everything's looking dark, it's fine because he's always with you, he's by your side. It sounds... I'm surprised no Christian band has covered that. Has there been any? Then we've got the wonderful closer to the album, Born to Touch Your Feelings, a beautiful ballad. And this one here, they had some of their female friends of the band here, doing the spoken words at the very end. And it's actually interesting because I can understand pretty much all of the Japanese. But I'm not going to say what it is now because I've forgotten. I have to listen to it again. This is a really cool album, and of course after this they went off to Japan, a very exciting thing. Apparently Klaus Meine said it was the first time he ever had gotten on a plane. And they recorded some of their live shows there and came out with the Tokyo tapes. But by the time that album was released, Uli Jon Roth had already gone off to form Electric Sun. Well, a string of controversial album covers, and the next one up was the album cover for Love Drive. Don't see the back cover here. Ah, here it is. I always thought this is one of the greatest album covers ever. I mean, it's just such a silly idea. A man and a woman dressed up very nicely in the backseat of a car with the man interested in the woman's breasts. I mean, that's probably a very normal thing. Couple going out together, they're in love, and of course they're going to want some sexy time together. However, the man's hand being like stretched out with all this bubble gum in here, a massive amount of bubble gum over her breast. This was just such a crazy thing. Apparently, it was Storm Thurgeson. It was, not apparently, it was Storm Thurgeson of Hypnosis Records, the design, not records, design, the ones who had done a lot of the Pink Floyd album covers, Wish You Were Here, for example. They're the ones, or he was the one who came up with the concept for this. And of course, it got the band in a lot of trouble, so an alternate album cover was used where you just see like a large scorpion against a black background. Later on, apparently, for the CD reissues, this album, the original cover, was allowed once again. This, of course, now is where they have the new guitarist, Matthias Jabs. And the story behind that was, of course, after Uli Jon Roth left, they needed to get a new guitarist. And apparently, Herman Railbell said, if you want to get a good guitarist, you've got to go to England, go to London, that's where you get the best ones. So they went to London and auditioned about 140 different guitarists. But when they came back to Hanover, they decided to audition him. Actually, I think I heard him say that they auditioned Matthias first, just to kind of like I'll just come over and jam with the band a bit. Then they'd gone off to London, and then they came back again, and they said, come over and jam with us again. And then they said, would you like the position? You can be the lead guitar player in the band. We'll give it to you. So he accepted. However, at this time, Michael Schenker was leaving UFO. And so he rejoined the Scorpions. So during the recording sessions for this album, apparently some sources say Michael only played on 3 to 5 tracks. Michael claims that he played on all the tracks. But anyway, basically we're looking at a split between Matthias Jabs and Michael Schenker playing on this album. So actually 3 guitarists with Rudolf Schenker as well. However, during the after this was recorded, they decided they were going to keep Michael Schenker in the band. Matthias was kind of let out of the band again, but then during the tours, Michael, with his alcoholism problems, started becoming unreliable, and so Matthias had to come in and substitute for him sometimes. And finally, before the tour was over, they just let Michael out of the band and kept Matthias Jabs in. And so we got our classic Scorpions lineup for the 1980s. This album here, by the way, is considered by some critics to be the pinnacle of the Scorpions' work. It does, of course, have some brilliant tracks on here. Loving You Sunday Morning, Another Piece of Meat. Well, pretty much the whole album, Always Somewhere, is a beautiful ballad, as well as Holiday. Coast to Coast, an instrumental, a little bit unusual. Is There Anybody There? Of course, Love Drive. Yeah, pretty much the whole album is just one solid, good piece of work. I just tend to prefer Uli Jon Roth's era a bit more because I find there's a little bit more variety in the styles of the songs. Nevertheless, I do think this is a great album. And yes, I do love the cover. It's just so funny. So, Scorpions release a new album in the 1980s on March 31st, 1980. Another album cover designed by Storm Thurgeson. And apparently this one here also was controversial. Now, Storm said that he couldn't exactly see it himself, but he knew there must be something rude in there somewhere. We basically have a man standing in front of a woman and a dog. I suppose it's kind of suggestive. Man's got a beer in his hand, I guess. I don't know. Whatever. It's called Animal Magnetism. And this album did really well. Let's see. It reached gold status by 1984 and reached platinum status by 1991. This is, as well as Love Drive, another fantastic album. I mean, Make It Real. Don't Make No Promises Your Body Can't Keep. Let's see here, Lady Starlight, which is a beautiful slow ballad and the only Scorpion song to actually feature orchestral woodwinds and strings, if you can believe that. The Zoo is, of course, one of the classics on this, and the title track, I always love it because it has this like really like an eerie, ominous feel to it. Like it's about like, you know, I need, you know, you to love me and so on, but it just sounds like some crazy person. And at the very end, there's this, you know, this laugh. But I really love it. Because it's a song that has a very different style from the rest of the album. Anyway, Scorpions' Animal Magnetism. The band were ready to start recording their next album. However, Klaus Meine developed some vocal cord problems. I read somewhere he had developed polyps on his vocal cords. He was told by doctors, you have to quit singing. And he basically thought he was going to have to leave the band. And they said to him, he said to them, go on without me. And they said, no, you do what you gotta do. We can wait with the album. So he went and had a couple of operations, and then he had some, I think, 6 months of vocal training before he was finally able to come back. In the meantime, the band had already started work on the new album, and they had Don Dokken come in, singing some of the lead vocals on the demos anyway, while the band got the songs together. And of course, the album coming out in March 1982, their 8th album, Blackout. The cover art apparently was by a painter named Gottfried, what did I write here? Gottfried Hellmein, I guess. It is a self-portrait of himself, but it does look suspiciously similar to Rudolf Schenker. And apparently Rudolf was this guy in the video. Nothing about controversy here. I guess because there are no women in suggestive positions and no children shooting each other in a graveyard, a cemetery. But yeah, this album here was the most successful album to date. Let's see here, going gold in the US by 1982, and platinum by 1984. Of course, you've got the title track, Blackout. You've got Can't Live Without You, one of the killer songs on here, No One Like You. Kind of a little bit more powerful than a standard Scorpions power ballad, but that was the first Scorpions song I ever heard, by the way. Oh, let's see, we have Now, Dynamite, China White, which I think is a great song. Again, it's a song with that kind of slower, heavier, more ominous feel to it, similar to the title track of the previous album, Animal Magnetism. But yeah, basically another solid, hard-rocking, kick-ass album. And what can you say? This is like one of their biggest selling albums. And, you know, in our story of the first 10 albums of the Scorpions, so far it has just been stepping up album after album. A lot of lineup changes, but none of them detrimental to the band. The lineup changes have just taken them to the next step and brought them up higher each time, which is really interesting. So that brings us to the 9th album, released in March of 1984, Love at First Sting. And the cover photo, once again, being a controversial one. The photograph was actually made by Helmut Newton, a very famous photographer who does a lot of poses of black and whites of women, partially dressed or barely dressed. So it's not really a surprise. Of course, it's a very sexy album cover because it's very passionate. The man is kissing the woman's neck, her breast is partly exposed and leg is up the side, and we all know what's going on here. And I remember in an interview sometime in the 1980s, Rudolf Schenker saying, no, it's not about sex, it's about life. We are celebrating life. Yeah, the creation of life. Anyway, human life. Apparently, actually, the initial sessions for this album were done with Jimmy Bain and Bobby Rondinelli, who were of Rainbow at the time there. I think Rainbow was just had just wrapped up. Interestingly, this is, according to Wikipedia, one of the first heavy metal albums to be recorded digitally, 1984. It went to number 6 on Billboard, and let's see here, it reached 2 times platinum by the end of the year, and 3 times platinum by 1985. The song Rock You Like a Hurricane reached number 25 on the Billboard Top 100, and I want to mention something here. I have this Hit Parader Heavy Metal Awards 1984. Motley Crue, Judas Priest, and Scorpions down here. And Scorpions are mentioned in several places in the magazine. Rather than flip through and hold it up, I'll show some pictures here. They're in for, let's see here, I think it was best top 5 albums. They're in here for top 5 songs. They're in here for top 5 guitarists with Matthias Jabs. And also top 5 drummers with Herman Rarebell. And of course, around this time, Herman Rarebell went and did a solo album where he did a cover of the famous 60s surf drum solo song, Wipeout. So that brings us to the 10th album, Savage Amusement, which I had on cassette in the 80s, but I don't have on CD now. Basically, I was kind of disappointed with that album. It was released on April 18th, 1988. It reached number 5 in the US and was platinum by June. It was the final album with Dieter Dierks as producer, and interestingly, Lee Aaron, Canadian hard rock heavy metal vocalist Lee Aaron, sang backing vocals on Rhythm of Love. After the release of this album, the Scorpions played twice behind the Iron Curtain, in Leningrad and I think in Moscow as well. And basically, the band's success just continued. So this is a very interesting, a different course from the other 2 bands we looked at. The Scorpions just continued moving up, 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 and just hit super big time with their 9th album and just continued the success with their 10th album. And they managed to keep their lineup from 1979 right through the 80s, through all of their success, and into the early 90s as well, before finally the lineup would change, the style would change, and the band would then pursue a different kind of a course. Their latest album, Rock Believer, I really like it. I hadn't bought an album since Savage Amusement, and Rock Believer is just like these classic 80s Scorpions albums, just in the new style. Some of it almost a little bit too close, but still really great to listen to. So there you have it. That's the first 10 albums of the Scorpions and how that band's career course went during that time. So it's February. We're going to be taking a look at one more band this month. Can you guess who it is? Who released an album on Friday the 13th, February, Friday the 13th in 1970? If you know the answer, you'll know what my next video is going to be about. So until then, everybody stay safe, take care, stay healthy. See you then. Thanks for watching. Oh, and if you got some favorite Scorpion songs or albums, go ahead and leave me a comment. I'm always glad to read comments from people. Thank you. All right, bye everyone.